everything we do is intentional and willful. So I think I'm controlling my behavior. You think you're controlling yours. I see you do something that I might have done in a similar situation. I think you intentionally control that. We see a dog doing something that would be similar to what we do. We think we know why the dog is doing that because it had some intention. But the fact is, if we start taking these things apart in the brain, we see that the systems that control very simple behaviors are not the ones that are doing all this high-level conscious thought. Take the example of the area I've worked on for all these years, which is threat detection. Now, this part of the brain called the amygdala is key to the detection and response to threat in a kind of basic sense. A threat comes up, you freeze if there's a snake, for example. Now, it's all because of that. It's been assumed that the reason you freeze is because you're afraid, and therefore that the amygdala is also making the fear, because the amygdala experiences the fear, and that's why you produce the response. But for the longest time and throughout most of my career, I've said the amygdala does not consciously experience fear. And yet my work has been used to kind of sell and defend this idea of the amygdala is the brain's fear center. And I think that's completely wrong.
Why do you think it's been misinterpreted?
It's a long, complicated story, but partly it's my fault because I was not as vigilant as I should have been when I was describing it. See, what I did was I would talk about the amygdala as a non-conscious state of fear, non-conscious, implicit fear. And I would say that, well, the neocortex is where we consciously experience fear, and those are separate. But that was too complicated. The journalists kind of ignored it, and it just became the amygdala as the brain's fear center. Even the scientists ignored it because we were studying, and I kind of gave up after a while and said, okay, we talk about it in terms of fear, because that there was a lot of money to be directed towards research if you were studying fear and how you could treat that. But I think it's been kind of a wrong path because it's led to the development of medications that don't really work. So all the big companies are getting out of the anti-anxiety business, anti-fear business, because people still feel fearful or anxious when they take them.
You mean like Xanax? Things along those lines?
Yeah.
Companies are getting out of the Xanax business?
Benzos, Xanax, yeah. I mean, they're either that or they're repurposing them for other purposes, But so what happens is the way these things, the basic drugs were discovered in the 60s, almost accidentally in some cases, not rather than by some hypothesis. So the only thing that's been discovered since then is more versions of the same thing with slightly fewer side effects. But there's been no new discovery of a new kind of drug that's going to help people. And why is that? Well, the way the drugs are discovered is they take a rat or a mouse, put it in a challenging situation, give it some different medications, and the ones that make the animal less timid in those situations is assumed to make the animal less fearful, and that's why he's less timid. So when you give it to a person, they should be less fearful. But what you find is, say, a person with social anxiety might find it easier to go to the party. They're less timid, but still anxious while they're there. And the reason is that we now know is that damage to the amygdala in a person doesn't necessarily also eliminate the feeling of fear. It gets rid of the body responses, but not the feeling. So it was a misunderstanding of what behavior can tell us. We treat behavior as if it's an ambassador of the mind, but behavior is really a tool of survival. It goes back to those first cells that ever lived who had to defend against danger. Bacterial cells move in the water, and then they come across a gradient of some chemical that's a toxin. As soon as they detect that, they bounce away and go in a different direction. If they find a gradient of something that is a nutrient, they keep going and absorb it. So they have the ability to detect what's useful and harmful in their lives. These are not there for psychology. They're simply there to keep the organism alive. And many of the behaviors that persist throughout the whole history of life are like that. They're there because each of the cells in the body has to, do all these things to stay alive. And so the organism as a whole has to do it as well. Defend against danger, incorporate nutrients, balance fluids, thermoregulate, reproduce. So these are survival tools, not mind tools. Now, we can use our mind in conjunction with these things, and because we conflate every time we're freezing in the front of a snake to the fact that the fear is what's causing it. But the fear is a separate process. It's the awareness that that stuff is happening to you.
The awareness that that stuff is happening to you. So
no self, no fear.
Oh.
That's my T-shirt here.
Whoa.
It's my merch on the book.
Now, how do things like Xanax work? What's the mechanical process?
Okay, so that's a part of the class of drugs called a benzodiazepine, and they bind to receptors in the brain. The brain has receptors for all kinds of chemicals, and many of these things are things that exist in nature. And what that they bind to is a receptor called the GABA receptor, which is the major inhibitory transmitter in the brain. So when you have a benzodiazepine binding to a GABA receptor, what it's going to do is increase inhibition. So the kind of simple reason why those things can help is they kind of inhibit. So they tone down the brain a bit. And so things that would normally trigger a response no longer trigger it. So it's like increasing the threshold for something to bother you in a sense.
And a lot of people enjoy that with alcohol. You're not supposed to?
Well, alcohol also attacks those receptors,
Yeah.
so it's like you get double the effect.
Right. Is that why they tell people don't have Xanax with alcohol?
Yeah, because you can, if you take a lot of Xanax and drink a lot of booze, you can OD.
Or you could just say crazy things and not totally be aware. Do you remember that story about a woman? She was, I believe she was a publicist, and she got on a plane.
Right.
She was flying to Africa, and she said, "I'm going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. I'm white. LOL." She thought she was just being funny.
Uh-huh.
And you laughed, and she landed in Africa.
That must have been a surprise.
Ooh, do you know the story?
No, but there are other
Oh my
stories like
God.
that.
This was one of the original stories of someone ruining their entire life
right.
with just putting, one little tweet
Right.
online. She thought she was being funny. Like
Yeah.
she would say a bunch of snarky things like that, a bunch of funny, trying to be funny.
Right.
But she was on Xanax and drinking,
Yeah.
and woke up completely oblivious,
Right.
and her life had been destroyed.
Yeah.
She was fired. She was a social pariah, and I'm pretty sure that was Xanax and alcohol that she was blaming it on.
Yeah, well, these are powerful drugs. And so, back to how they work when they work. So a drug like that, all of the drugs that we take go to the entire body. They're not able to just, find their way to one little spot in the brain and do their trick. There's this, talk about magic bullet drugs that might be able to be targeted for specific circuits, but that's fantasy at this point. So if you reduce inhibition in the entire brain, yes, you might reduce anxiety, but you're also going to change a lot of other things. So you're going to make, for example, forethought and ability to rein in things like the stuff the woman was saying more difficult because they're attacking the prefrontal cortex where you have some inhibitory control over behavior. They're going to alter your ability to retrieve and store memories and to attend to things. And, to the extent that these drugs have a positive effect on some people, it's been said that part of the reason is that it's kind of a general blunting of emotion. It's not an anti-anxiety drug. It's just kind of a dulling of everything. And you get anti-anxiety as a part of that. But if we want to understand how to do better, we have to, figure out what the brain circuit that's really making us anxious is, and not just what's making us, not toning down everything. It's kind of like, you go to a restaurant, the music's too loud. Somebody says, please turn it down. So they turn it down a little bit. The music stays the same. It's the same song, but it's not as annoying, because you've turned the volume down. And I think that's what a lot of what these medications can do is turn the volume down a bit or turn it up, depending on what you do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there some sort of a slingshot effect? Like after you take these things and your anxiety is ramped up afterwards?
Well, it can be a rebound
Yeah.
effect. There can also be kind of a lot of people next day feel depressed, because they're just the stuff is out of your system and just kind of if you take, it's kind of like taking sleeping pills. Things like Ambien are of the same general category of drug, benzodiazepines. And so you get this hangover the next day.
Okay, so it's just a physiological response to the medication.
Yeah.
It's not that if you alleviate some anxiety, then the anxiety wants to come back even stronger.
Well, no, I mean, so I've proposed in my previous book that we each have an anxiety set point. That that let's say you're worried about something, and all of a sudden that gets resolved. Whew, that just makes room for the next thing to worry with. So, we each kind of fill that void because our brain is, we've developed a brain that has a certain kind of set point for everything it's doing, and that just makes room for, to fill that up. If you're an anxious person, you probably will always be somewhat anxious. So there's no magic bullet that's going to take that out. What you have to do is attack the process from knowledge of how it all works. And that requires that we have a more sophisticated understanding than is possible from simply observing behavior, because behavior does not tell you necessarily what's on the mind. Behavior tells you how the brain has responded. But, just to go back to the fear threat example, when, let's say I bring you into the laboratory, show you a picture of something like a blue square. My colleague Liz Phelps, who used to be at NYU, is now at Harvard, did experiments like this. And every time the blue square would come on, the person would get a mild shock to their finger. And so then she would present the blue square subliminally. That means, really quickly with something that follows it that kind of masks it. And that prevents the information from getting into the conscious mind. And so the person said, I didn't see anything. But if you put the person in an imaging machine, fMRI, and image what's happening, that stimulus, that threat, the blue square gets to the amygdala, turns it on, the heart begins to race, palms are sweating, but the person has no fear. The person doesn't know it's there and doesn't experience fear. The amygdala is not about fear. It's about detecting and responding to danger. In order to be afraid, that has to reach your conscious mind so that you can experience it as a state of this autonoetic consciousness that we're talking about, a self-involved consciousness.
That's hard for people to separate.
Yeah. Well,
the idea that there's a physical response, but that your mind's unaware of it.
Right. But when you understand that, that's why you come to understand that's why the medications are not working. They're targeted to work on these underlying systems in rats or mice, but that's not where we are experiencing our anxiety.
But these medications are very profitable, right? I mean, people enjoy it. Millions of prescriptions get written. Are they just going to phase those out?
They'll probably, they're probably all going off patent. And because the company can't find anything new, they're not going to keep pursuing it because it's not going to be a profit anymore.
But don't people still want them? I mean, it seems like that's a really popular medication.
Yes, it'll be like they'll go to, they'll become, generics, and people will be able to get them for less money.
And they'll just do with whatever they want.
Yeah.
Off-label, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, for example, the drugs that are available do help people because it's important to reduce the behavioral timidity and the physiological arousal that goes with that. Because if you don't treat that, then the conscious mind will be reactivated by those responses. If you only treat the conscious mind, then the physiological stuff will bring the conscious stuff back. Everything will bring back everything else unless you treat the whole system. And you have to do that, you have to understand the system. And we've just misunderstood it, I think, for so long.